All right, so welcome everyone. My name is Brian J. Griffith, and I'll be the host of today's virtual book talk event. So just for an introduction to myself, I am the inaugural Eugen and Jacqueline Weber postdoctoral scholar in European history at UC Los Angeles during the academic years 2020 to 2021, and also next year, 2021 to 2022. This book talk is the third in a series of book talks that I am hosting in conjunction with a course that I'm currently teaching here at UCLA titled Interwar Crisis, Europe 1918 to 1939. Our next and final virtual book talk event will be on Wednesday, June 2nd from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And that will focus on Edward B. Westerman's recently published monograph, Drunk on Genocide, Alcohol and Mass Murder in Nazi Germany, published by Cornell University Press in cooperation with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. So if you'd like to register for that last book talk, you can take a look at my course website, which I'm entering in right here, that has the registration portal there for you if you're interested in joining us on June the 2nd. I'd also like to acknowledge this book talk series co-sponsors and collaborators, which are UCLA's Center for European and Russian Studies. You can find them on both Facebook and Twitter under the handle UCLA CERS, UCLA CERS. And also for this particular book talk event, the Istituto Italiano di Cultura di Los Angeles, which is the Italian Cultural Institute of Los Angeles. So thank you to both of our co-sponsors and collaborators for this particular meeting. A few words on the meeting format and procedures. So I'm going to begin by providing a brief introduction for today's speaker, which of course will be followed by a 30-minute presentation on Dr. Fogu's recently published book, the subject of today's meeting, The Fishing Net and the Spiderweb. After Claudio's presentation, we'll make time for some Q&A during the remaining about a half an hour or so. If you're joining us here on Zoom, which like the last book talk is in fact the only place that you can be joining us right now live, I would encourage you to participate in the Q&A session. And if you have a question that you'd like to ask during that last half an hour, you can indicate your desire to deliver that question in two different ways. You can either write out the entire question in the chat dialogue here on Zoom, and I will take that as your desire for me to read that for you. If you would rather appear on camera and ask your question yourself, you can just indicate your desire to do so, and I'll call on you in the proper order. Finally, as a courtesy to our speaker and also to the attendees, I'd like to kindly request that you mute your microphones until it's your turn to speak. Okay, so for the introduction for Dr. Claudio Fogu. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, Dr. Claudio Fogu. Dr. Fogu is an intellectual historian of modern Italy with a special emphasis on the 2 decades of Benito Mussolini's fascist dictatorship. Claudio earned his doctorate in modern European history right here at UC Los Angeles, where I'm a postdoctoral scholar now, in 1995, and shortly thereafter was appointed as assistant professor at The Ohio State University. Dr. Fogu is currently an associate professor of Italian studies at UC Santa Barbara. Claudio has been the recipient of numerous grants and fellowships, including an Alexander von Humboldt Foundation grant, a Jean Monnet Fellowship at the European University Institute in Fiesole, Italy, and also a Wilsonian Foundation Fellowship, among many, many others. Dr. Fogu's research has appeared in many prestigious journals and edited volumes, including the Journal for Contemporary History, the Journal for Modern European History, History and Theory, Modernism, Modernity, Storia e Storiografia, and many, many, many more worth mentioning. I had to cut the list short. There were so many of these journals that he's published in. Claudio is also the author of a number of edited volumes and monographs, including his first monograph, The Historic Imaginary, The Politics of History in Fascist Italy, published by the University of Toronto Press in 2003, Probing the Ethics of Holocaust Culture, which he co-edited with Wolf Kahnsteiner and Todd Presner, published by Harvard University Press in 2016. And of course, the topic for today's book talk event, The Fishing Net and the Spiderweb, Mediterranean Imaginaries and the Making of Italians, published late last year by Palgrave Macmillan. If you haven't already had a chance to purchase a copy of the book, we do have a special discount code that we can share with you here. If you click on the link that I've just linked to in the chat dialog and use the event Fogu 2021 discount code, you will be given a 30% discount on your purchase. Just on a personal note, before we begin with the presentation and the Q&A, I just wanted to acknowledge that Dr. Fogu was indeed my PhD mentor while I was studying at UC Santa Barbara between 2012 and 2020. And so it's really, truly a pleasure to introduce you to and to be able to host this event for Dr. Claudio Fogu. So Claudio, I'll hand it over to you now.
Wow, thank you, Brian. Thank you for the presentation. And I think you can all imagine what a double excitement and anxiety I'm experiencing by presenting in front, hosted by my mentee in my alma mater, which was my alma mater for 10 years. I did undergraduate and graduate studies there. So this is really a momentous, and I have to recognize that it's taken me quite a while to try to bring together 20 years of thoughts and research, which is what went into the production of this very slim book and very expensive book. Even with the discount, I won't blame any of you to just escape horrified from that price. And if you really, really are interested in reading it, please contact me. I might find a way to get it to you. So I want to begin with the usual little apology. Well, thank you, Brian, of course, for organizing this. This is really a tribute to you and to your organizing abilities, but also I am very touched by this and your invitation. I want to apologize for just putting one single picture up right behind me, a picture that tells 1,000 stories, but I'm not gonna even tell you about the picture because I don't have the time otherwise to tell you about the book. So I'm gonna just go right into the book, and I hope to be able to keep within the 30 minutes, but it's going to be a challenge. And I would like to start immediately from the title, The Fishing Net and the Spider Web. Two metaphors that refer to two forms or matrices or models. I use interchangeably these words in the book of Mediterranean imaginaries, whose formation my book traces back to the ancient Mediterranean. The first, the fishing net, to the archaic period that the new Brodels of the ancient Mediterranean world, Peregrine Horden and Dominique Purcell, identify with the generalized connectivity of Mediterranean emporia between the 8th and the 3rd century BCE. And the latter, the spider web, that I trace to the territorialization of the Mediterranean Sea under Roman Imperium, perfectly captured by the term Mare Nostrum, focusing on the role played by the islands and coastlines of the Phlegraean area, contemporary Naples and its maritime hinterland in particular. I argue in this book that what today we call Italy's South was the initial center of production for both of these imaginaries and remained for centuries what Horden and Purcell call the biogeographical center of the Mediterranean continent. In these few initial sentences, I'm aware of having already packed a series of terms, concepts that already scream for explanation. Where do these metaphors come from? And what is a Mediterranean imaginary? Or better, what is an imaginary tout court? And a Mediterranean continent? Are you serious? Is that another metaphor, or are you proposing a new metageographical notion? I'm sure that John Agnew, who's staring at me right now, will probably come up with that question soon enough. To answer these questions head on would require that I spend all of my time on them, leaving you wondering what the book is actually about. So I'd like to come to them in the course of illustrating the story that this book tells. And since we are in the land of Hollywood, let me introduce it with a series of pitches designed to speak to the different academic audiences for which the book was intended. For the Mediterranean studies crowd, the fishing net and the spider web is a Mediterranean history of Italy in which the history of the Mediterranean meets history in the Mediterranean, the two categories that Horden and Purcell in their magistral, The Corrupting Sea, have theorized. For the Italianist public, the fishing net and the spider web is the sequel to Nelson Moe's The View from the Vesuvius, seeking to tell the cultural history of the Italian peninsula from its unification to the present from the point of view of the Mediterranean Sea, and even more to the south point of view of the Vesuvius. Last but not least, on a more purely historiographical plane, in the fishing net and the spider web, the superhero of Italian cultural history, the Southern Question, finally meets the other superhero, the making of Italians. And I really love this kind of pitch, if I may say so. These three pitches, however, also summarize the three main stages of the history I tell, which, as I've already hinted at, starts in the 8th century BCE with the arrival of a band of brothers or cousins from the Hellenic island of Euboea onto the island called Ischia, where they found the first Hellenic emporium in the so-called West, which they called Pitecuse. But wait, why go all the way to Ischia and not stop in Sicily or Calabria or any of the coastal areas of southern Italy? Is well known to previous travelers from the Eastern Mediterranean, or even Capri, all of which could be found on the way to Ischia. Why pushing all the way to that island, and why then stop there? The answer I give to this question is that those Hellenians, we would call them later on Greeks, were searching for a partnership with the iron masters of the Mediterranean world, the Tyrrhenians, which we would call later Etruscans, who inhabited the central areas of Italy and its coastlines, as well as the islands of Elba, Corsica, and Sardinia. The realism of the famous vase Il Cratere del Naufragio, dated 730 and 20 BCE, and preserved in the Museum of Pitecuse in Ischia, tells us the story of a syncretic maritime civilization that had nothing to do with the stylized pottery we know as Greek, because it specifically rejected the identitarian logic of the polis and operated according to the four network dynamics that historians Irad Malkin has identified as constitutive of the archaic Mediterranean world. First, a ship-to-shore spatial orientation that transformed the sea itself into a hinterland and even coastal areas into islands, as Pitecuse did with Cuma and Parthenope. A many-to-many pattern of interaction that populated the Mediterranean world of innumerable others rather than an us versus them or a single other. Third, a syncretic or a syncretistic modality of cultural identities formation that created middle grounds in which not only were products, customs, and cults hybridized, but colonizers and local populations also achieved what post-colonial scholars today call creolization. Finally, a fractal logic of transfiguration between material and cultural mental conditions in which every part of the network behaved in network ways, resulting in what Malkin calls a small world, that is, a multidirectional, decentralized, non-hierarchical, boundless, and proliferating, accessible, expansive, and interactive system of self-organization. This is what I call the fishing net matrix of the Mediterranean imaginary. established by islanders who projected their mentality onto the construction of a multicultural trading space that forged and simultaneously responded to promptings from a maritime matrix of belonging. This matrix operated outside the logic of rootedness in territory, language, traditions, and self-sameness, for it lived in the experience of risky but unfettered mobility along a crisscrossing of south to north and west to east sea routes, which connected over 1,000 coastal colonies and city-states around the entire perimeter of the Mediterranean, of the archaic Mediterranean. And rather than fish, this Mediterranean fishing net caught islands, large or small, entangled like prey. Mediterranean islands played a vital role of activating, tightening, promoting the sea routes that traversed the fishing net. My first contention then is that this fishing net Mediterranean had its own Mediterranean, that is, a middle ground where these dynamics found heightened expression. This was the Phlegraean middle ground, a small world centered on the coastal emporia of Kyme and Neapolis and the islands of Pitecuse, Procita, and Capri. Yet, as we well know, this fishing net Mediterranean was not to last beyond the 3rd century BCE. It would be first weakened by the rivalry between Greek polis in the metropole in the mainland Greece, and finally replaced by the logic of Roman imperium. The territorialization of the Mediterranean into what the Romans called Mare Nostrum established the spiderweb matrix of a new Mediterranean imaginary, born of the fact that not only all roads led to Rome, as the saying goes, but all Roman roads led to the seaports and then extended into sea routes under the control of the Roman navy. This spiderweb matrix had, of course, its symbolic center in Rome, but Rome had its own double in the island of Capri, the residence of emperors in the Phlegraean middle ground, and probably the closest that any provincial traveler ever came to the center of the empire. Capri, in fact, stood right in front of the two harbors, Puteoli and Misenum, that came to constitute the commercial and military centers of the Roman spiderweb. The actual fulcrum of Roman imperium turned out to reside, therefore, in the same middle ground in which the fishing net matrix was born centuries earlier, the Phlegraean fields and islands. And this double exposure, I argue, had long-lasting consequences in the history of Naples, in the Mediterranean, as well as the Mediterranean history of Italy. The first part of my tale ends, therefore, with showing the enduring oscillation between emporium and imperium, fishing net and spiderweb's form of social, economic, and cultural networking that marked the life of the Italian peninsula as a whole and of its south and islands in particular, from antiquity to its so-called unification, thereby making it part and parcel of a Mediterranean continent that, although unnamed, was as real as those landmasses we define with that term, a meta-geographical space of interactions where islands functioned as capitals of integrated microregions that, although without borders, were as real and integrated as any nation states for the communities of islanders and coastal dwellers that belong to them. Just like the disintegration of the Mare Nostrum in the 5th century AD will continue to inspire political actors like the Byzantine, Ottoman, and Spanish empires towards projects of limited or total Mediterranean imperium, so the fishing net matrix continued its fractal reproduction in the decentralized networks of the Italian maritime republics and in the Mediterranean projection of the Kingdom of Naples, which inherited the contours of the ancient Magna Graecia, as well as the double legacy of emporium and imperium. A kingdom whose commercial economy and cultural syncretism was so marked by the ideal of belonging to the Mediterranean continent that it not only renamed itself Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in 1821, thereby affirming its kind of aspiration to be an island kingdom. But in the same year, it approved the most ambitious engineering project of that century, the digging of a canal that would have connected the Adriatic and Tyrrhenium and practically detached the peninsular part of the kingdom from the landed body of Europe to reclaim its role as the middle ground of the Mediterranean continent, refusing therefore to also play point and heel to the encroaching image of the Italian boot. While the first part of my story is therefore one that marks the Italian peninsula as belonging to the Mediterranean and instantiates its so-called South as the enduring middle ground of this liquid continent, the second part partially overlaps with the first one because precisely at the moment when the Kingdom of Naples exerted its maximum Mediterranean projection in the century between the mid-18th century and the mid-19th century, as Nelson Moe and many others have shown, this Mediterranean middle ground was also constructed as Europe's South in the age of the Grand Tour. And this was no innocent metageographical contrast. The golden age of Naples, in which the capital of the kingdom gave full swing to its Emporian imaginary, rising to the rank of third commercial fleet in the Mediterranean, was therefore also the age in which the European gaze of the Enlightenment identified the Italian South as a liminal space between Europe, Africa, and Asia. And this liminality, as post-colonial theorists like Minolo and Cujano have shown us, was the mark of a new form of coloniality that would soon coalesce in what they called meridionism, a paradigm that by the early 19th century, in parallel with Orientalism, constructed the Italian South as Europe's internal other. A backward, uncivilized, primitive, and finally savage land and people soon to become identified as a race that would all but justify the way in which it was first conquered by Garibaldi's 1000 in 1860, then delivered soon after to another king descending from the northern region of Piedmont, and finally treated by the newly born Italian state as the first African territory conquered by a European kingdom, anticipating but of a few years the scramble for Africa. From this Mediterranean perspective, I reinterpret the so-called Italian Risorgimento as the formation of the first European empire state, a new form of imagined community based on the biopolitics of territorialization and expansion. Italy, of course, was not made at all, as D'Azeglio said, in 1860, nor in 1866, nor in 1870, and so on and so forth. And of the making of Italians, which basically meant severing the South from its Mediterranean belonging and turning Southerners into Northerners. I spent considerable time in the book detailing how the Risorgimento and post-Risorgimento culture served to suppress any strands of connective cultural and imaginary tissue between the peninsula and its maritime existence. But the fundamental point of my story is to show the role that the Mediterranean rapidly came to play in the making of Italians from the last decade of the 19th century to the present. This is the part of my story in which spiderweb and fishing net imaginaries assume very significant sociocultural formations that go from the emigrant nation described by Mark Choate to Giuseppe Sergi's theory of the Mediterranean race, all the way to Marinetti's Mafarca, the futurist, and D'Annunzio's Human Endeavor, which I analyze as mutually reinforcing forms of Emporian, providing an opposite pole to the dominant forms of Mediterranean imperium, often found in the same protagonists. From the notion of Latinità, propagandized by the racialized rhetorics of D'Annunzio, to the Corridinian and Pascolian myth of the proletarian nation, whose natural and rightful vital space of expansion was an Italian Mare Nostrum that would have also solved the Southern question by creating a South to the south of the South, that is the invasion of Libya, to, of course, the futurist poetics of aggressive and perennial avant-garde expansion, all forms of modernist nationalisms, as Emilio Gentile defined them, which merged into the cauldron of what I call fascist modernism, Mediterraneanism. I apologize. That was my first book. While my book brings the story of the key role played by Mediterranean imaginaries in the making of Italianness, Italy and Italians all the way to the present, let me focus the last few minutes of this talk on my interpretation of fascism as a political form of Mediterraneanism, where by this term I mean not only the apex of Mediterranean imperium, but the ideological reification of the oscillation between imperium and emporium that characterize the formation of the Mediterranean imaginary I look at in the preceding chapters. Long before Mussolini said a single word about Rome, and drawing inspiration from the Nuncio's Fiume endeavor, in December 1919, he already pointed out to the inorientamento of Italy, that is, its maritime expansion into the Eastern Mediterranean through the ports of Fiume, Venice, Trieste, Ancona, and especially Bari, as fascism's principal foreign policy objective. And indeed, this Oriental Mediterranean projection remained the most consistent inspiration also for the actual foreign policy of the regime. Over time, it involved the tightening of relations between Libya, the Dodecanese Islands, and the so-called Africa Orientale, and their militarization in view of a great showdown with England. Well into the 1930s, Mussolini's war plans imagined a conflict with a single enemy, Great Britain, and were aimed at blocking the 5 straits of the Mediterranean, which now included, of course, also the Red Sea, Gibraltar, Sicily, Tunisia, Dardanelles, Suez, and Bab el-Mandeb in the Horn of Africa. The myth of Rome was therefore built around the scaffolding of this imperium imaginary, and it was this latter, I argue, that ended up playing a more determinant role in both ascendancy, mass popularity, and demise of fascism. Mussolini's projection of military imperium crumbled not only under the reality of World War II and British military might in the Mediterranean and North Africa, but well before the beginning of the war, in Mussolini's fateful decision to build the largest fleet of submarine in the Mediterranean while refusing to build a single aircraft carrier, because he so argued not only in public, but also with his generals, Italy was itself a gigantic aircraft carrier jutted into the middle of the Mediterranean. Except that while the British invention of the radar made the mighty submarine fleet ineffective, it was the imperium imaginary itself that blinded Mussolini to the fact that the Italian warplanes did not have sufficient fuel capacity to reach Gibraltar, which was the linchpin of his war plans. The imperium pole of fascist Mediterraneanism found further expression, of course, in the atrocious military pacification of Libya and the military occupation of Ethiopia, as well as in the laborious racial discourse that attempted to conciliate Sergi's theory of the Mediterranean race, which had made Italians into its historical pinnacle, and Nazi Aryanism into an uneasy synthesis that Fabrizio De Donno has called the Aryo-Mediterranean theory of race. But my principal contention about fascist Mediterraneanism is that it is not to be identified solely with the role that imperium matrix played in organizing the fascist imaginary and making it continuous, as many cultural historians before me have already highlighted, with the risorgimental formation of the Italian Empire State and the modernist nationalism that had coalesced around the invasion of Libya in 1912. What characterizes fascist Mediterraneanism is the continuity with the oscillation between spiderweb and fishing net forms of Mediterranean imaginary, which were constitutive of both the Annuncian and futurist rhetorics, and often found expression in the same cultural forms, movements, artifacts, and protagonists. Typical of this oscillation is the role that the Mediterranean came to play as imaginary inspiration to rescue modernist art and architecture from the accusation of esterophilia levied against it by the zealots of Stile Littorio since the early 1930s. The development of a Mediterranean theory and form of rationalist architecture by the likes of Carlo Antonio Rava and Florestano di Fausto have been fruitfully analyzed and also rightly criticized for their rhetorics of Mediterraneanness, which covered up the violent nature of colonial relations. But the fact that the most powerful discourse on Mediterraneanness had its fulcrum in the supposed syncretism and fractal reproduction of a Mediterranean-style architecture inspired by examples found in the colonies rather than exported from the metropole, speaks to the enduring legacy of a fishing net imaginary that I propose found its best expression in the realization of what I've called here and elsewhere the fascist state of exhibition. Fascist exhibition art was itself, and not any of its styles, the maximum expression of fascist aestheticization of politics. And the references to its Mediterranean origins by its protagonists are ubiquitous. The syncretic aesthetics of the Mostra della Rivoluzione, in which Sironi, Prampolini, and Longanesi collaborated side by side, and for those who know fascist aesthetics know that there couldn't be more different personalities and kind of fellow fascist travelers, but unfellow artists than Sironi, Prampolini, and Longanesi, collaborated side by side with 30 other artists, was often referred to as having proven the Mediterranean imaginary sustaining the development of exhibition art as the true most powerful weapon to generate enthusiasm, not mere consensus, for fascist accomplishments against the big idea of film playing that role. Two exhibition spaces gave full expression to the Emporian pole of fascist Mediterraneanism, beyond the general reference of a fascist exhibition art to the fishing net matrix. One, the Fiera del Levante in Bari, was a purely commercial nature of exhibition fair. The other, the Mostra delle Terre d'Oltremare, was organized in Naples in 1940, and they are the fulcrum of my chapter in interpretation of fascism. The former was financed and organized by local fascist elites in Bari in 1930 and lasted until 1939 to be resumed in the post-war era. It consisted in an annual international fair open to all sorts of commercial enterprises and exhibitors from all over the Mediterranean, but also Central and Northern Europe. At its height, it attracted 49 national exhibits, an annual average of 4,500 exhibitors, and almost 1 million visitors per year. In this respect, the Fiera del Levante gave full commercial expression to Mussolini's policy of inorientamento, but it also clearly pushed it at both symbolic and practical levels towards the realization of an Emporian imaginary that the organizers consistently and consciously connected to more local conditions. That is, to a southern solution to the southern question through the resurgence of Italy's south as a Mediterranean middle ground. Chief among the means by which the organizers aimed at giving economic form to the ancient Emporian matrix under fascism was their commitment to reconceptualize the very institution of the fair as a response to both the autarkic doctrine of the regime and the destruction of the human value of exchange by financial capitalism. These are quotes from their writings. The destruction of the latter, that is the human value of exchange, they argued had made prices no longer responsive to supply and demand in the market, but to trusts and cartels, thereby destroying the human factor for the benefit of stocks. The fair, in their estimation, had instead succeeded because it had always aimed at reciprocity. This is why organizers had not been concerned by years in which the balance between operations of exports and import at the fair had been negative. For them, the greatest success of the Fiera del Levante was in having attracted not only the whole Orient and Mediterranean, but also exhibitors and national exhibitions from the US, Brazil, and Argentina. That is, from that più grande Italia of mostly Southern emigrants that had been the most spectacular expression of the Emporian imaginary in the post-Risorgimento era. I see that my time is up. So I will leave my interpretation of the Mostra delle Terre d'Oltremare for your questions in case you're curious. But before I conclude, let me hint at the end of my story. With the demise of fascism, the dream of Mare Nostrum was surely put to rest once and for all. But the Imperium matrix, and especially the oscillation between Imperium and Emporian, forms of Mediterranean imaginary have continued to assert their preeminent force on the making of Italians up to the present. I trace their role in the Emporian politics of ENI and its first president and founder, Enrico Mattei, and in the development of a Mediterraneanness pret-à-porter through the globalization of Made in Italy and Oscar-winning Mediterranean flicks like Mediterraneo, Il Postino, Cinema Paradiso, etc. But I also point to the transfiguration of Mare Nostrum into what I call Mare Aliorum, a sea of threatening aliens connected to the so-called refugee crisis, the dramatic disappearance of bodies in the Mediterranean over the last 20 years. That while reversing the Imperium direction of control, has maintained and expanded to the whole of Europe the territorialization of the Mediterranean by literally extending European military control to a few miles off the coast of North Africa. This is also where my book comes full cycle, however, with the maîtres à penser that have inspired it. The Mediterranean historians Brodel, Malkin Abulafia, Orden and Purcell among the historians, but especially the Mediterranean thinkers Predrag Matvejevic, Jacques Derrida, Ian Chambers, and the recently departed and lamented Franco Cassano, whose commitment to push not only Italy, but Europe itself towards the imaginary pole of Emporion has inspired my decision to render explicit in my metaphors of the fishing net and the spider web, neither of which derive from my evidence, but are the fruit of my own imaginary elaboration, the participation of this book to the construction of a critical Mediterranean imaginary. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Claudio, for that fascinating and really thought-provoking presentation full of really incredible ideas and theoretical frameworks. That's in fact what I admire most about your scholarship. I feel brave enough to admit here today with everyone that your scholarship always has these kind of large-scale, macro-scale ideas and theoretical frameworks that are really useful for thinking your way through these difficult and complex topics. I'd actually like to invite everyone who may have a question to indicate your desire to either have your question read aloud by me or to appear on screen with Claudio if you'd like to ask it yourself. So use the chat dialogue either way to indicate your desire to intervene. I thought maybe I could, in lieu of there not being a line just yet, a queue for questions, perhaps Claudio, I could ask you one or two questions just out of my own bag of interests. So maybe we'll start light. I know that you mentioned when we first started that there was a story behind the image that appears behind you, and I thought I might invite you to expand upon that if you'd like.
Thank you very much, Brian. I swear I didn't pay you. I just wanted to put these statues because I love the way that they encapsulate the kind of the imaginary that I talk about. These are two statues that were recovered on the island of Procida by a captain of a boat, and then put on a niche somewhere on a street. And most inhabitants in Procida don't have any idea of what they stand for. But if you look at my the other one, this one. See, I'm not very good with my hands. So here, this is a kind of bifrontal representation of a youth that has a face that is whiter and the face that is darker, but they're exactly the same features. This would be the kind of representation that we would say in the Mediterranean has una faccia, una razza. A kind of prototype of light racialism in the Mediterranean. But actually in front, there is this other statue, which now we know goes back to an oral traditional story that we have no idea when it originated, but it's still being told. And when I have collected these oral stories for ages, the oral stories goes like, there was a beautiful Prochidan woman who, when the Saracens, Imori, and I'm using the terms that are being used in the story, invaded the island of Procida, she was chosen, of course, by the invaders as having to become a concubine of the Pasha, and she refused, but allowed her son to play with the son of the Pasha who had lost his mother and reacquired the smile by playing with the Prochidan son. So the story is about the independence of Prochidan women, who actually is a tradition that is very strong on the island, and the island is still known today for the fact that it had a maritime tradition that put actually women in charge of the roba, of the family finances. But the important thing is that consistently, then the story goes that the Bourbons arrive at some point and try to recapture the island. The Pasha escapes and they make a mistake. They grab the son of the Prochidana, leaving the son of the Pasha. The son of the Pasha, of course, is loved by this woman. Finally, after a few years, 200 miles from the island, I mean, constantly this 200 miles from the island, the Prochidans meet again with the Pasha. They exchange the two. They receive as much gold from the exchange as anything, and they come back, and everybody's a triumph. Now, what is interesting is that a lot of notions change, but there's always this 200 miles indicating this kind of projection way beyond anywhere fishermen, a community of fishermen would go, first. And secondly, the fact that Bourbons, who are 18th century, 19th century inhabitants, and Mori of the 13th century are completely at odds with each other, but they represent this sort of imaginary that embraces Arabs, Turks, and all of this space-time continuum. So to me, it's a story that represents this kind of continuum of illusions, of course, of imaginary construction that, however, do have some sense in their construction. And that's why I like those images. Thanks for the question, Brian.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that response. So Martin Brown here is in the chat dialogue, and he asks the following: how do you interpret the Italian modernist architecture of Asmara?
Wow, thank you, Martin. In fact, I don't, because I focus almost exclusively on Rhodes and Tripoli. And I make amends for that precisely because the number of books that have come out in the last few years and the interest in Asmara and also in architecture has made it very hard for me to comprehend everything. But I try to stay close to the kind of heroes of the story, Florestano di Fausto, who worked in both Libya and Rhodes. and Rava. So I'd be very interested to see how my book now lands with the experts and whether they see that my categories might suggest ways of interacting more specific studies of architecture under fascism.
All right, great. Next in line is Paul Lerner. Paul, if you'd like to ask your.
Hi, thank you, Brian. Claudio, wow, I'm reeling because this is just such an ambitious and fascinating project. And I had glimpses of this work at a much earlier stage, and I'm really just kind of in awe of how the project is transformed in scope and chronological scope and intellectual scope. So many congratulations. Now, I haven't read the book yet at all, so I'm really just posing a question here based on my familiarity with your earlier work and what you've presented here. I'm interested if you could discuss how your concept of the imaginary, which is the link between the two books, how that concept may have changed over time, if you're working with the same kind of theoretical construction here, or if that's evolved over time. And similarly, what this, forgive me if it's a bit of a generalist question, but what this perspective, how it kind of changes the understanding of fascism that you put forward in your earlier projects as being really kind of about certain it's very related on one level about certain manipulations of historical narrative and kind of symbolic meta language, but I'm wondering what how the kind of broader picture has, or if it has evolved over the time since you've been working on this book. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Paul, and hi. It's a special treat now to also find a dear colleague of mine in the first few years of my work, Paul, asking that question, because the first answer is a tough one. And it has more to do with the fact that when I first used that word in my first book, the word was current in French and Italian scholarship, where you don't need to explain ever what an immaginario is. You just give it for granted. And then what happens is that over this 10, 15 years or more, what I started looking is how books about the immaginario and Castoriadis and of course Appadurai and so many other ways in which this word starts having a constitutive and defining, but it never captured that kind of original sin of the Italian or the Romance languages. And that original sin I actually attributed to the word bestiario, which is the bestiary, the medieval bestiary. That's where I think the immaginario, the kind of formulation of of animals that were half true and half elaborations of new characteristics, but they always had a referent in reality. And so the bestiario could be just what you imagine this other world beyond to be. And in a way that has remained, but it's more now than ever before. Originally, my historic imaginary was more about some strictures that were rhetorical strictures, if you remember, the historic as a foundation of rhetorical codes, which signified presence in representation, but had that kind of sort of preordained. Now it's really the transfigurations of forms of imaginary in which I recognize that my own fishing net and spiderweb are part of that transfiguration process. And I guess in a certain sense, I need to really plead guilty to the fact that there might be something that I am trying to articulate, that it is partially a cultural area formed maybe from Catholic rhetorics that points to the imaginary in the Mediterranean. And that's the final answer to your question, as almost interchangeable. Mediterraneanness and imaginariness are in a way so intrinsically constructed that if you think about the networking images, the networking theory that Malkin develops, it's a theory of imaginary. In a certain sense, you can apply the many-to-many, the orientation, the syncretic, the fractal. That's precisely what how an imaginary works. So it's not just the Mediterranean, there is something very strong. And I guess I'll leave you just with that, and because I think I'll stop there. But your second question was about instead, what does this bring to our understanding of fascism? I think it's more about now a kind of legacy question than it was in the first. In the first case, I sort of launched out there this kind of suggestions that the decade and the development of this historic unit of time during fascism, then transformed into fashion, connected fascism to mass culture in general, to mass politics. And so we needed to understand fascism as internal to our system of reference, which could not just divide things into dictatorships and democracies, but that fascism was a laboratory of extremely important processes that partook of a post-war imaginary, even at a large global scale, like the historic imaginary I was talking about. This time, I'm much more interested in kind of this legacy that predates fascism and really traverse it and tries to come concretely into a cultural form, and continues, however, in an imaginary in Italy that should be more aware. And so I end the book with the sentence that I think many have picked up. It's like, it's time to Mediterraneanize Europe. That of course is my plea for an Emporian matrix to come back into an oscillation, which I don't think can be eradicated, but that it is important to be kept alive and not constrained within, even in fascism, it had its own Emporium side.
All right, thanks to Paul and Claudio for those questions and responses. John Agnew has a question. He writes, quote, I think your two models make considerable sense in interpreting the whole Italian question as you define it. I have a question about how perhaps under fascism, there wasn't an attempt, failed in the end, to bring together the Mediterranean and European quote unquote continents. Do you think that during fascism, there was an attempt to fuse the broader empire nation orientation to the Mediterranean with an ethnic/racial approach focused on the irredentist claims in Dalmatia and to the north? This is the focus of Roberta Perger's recent book.
John, I'm confronting this question, and I recognize it, and it's been posed to me. And I think the chapter on Fiume is the kind of a key chapter for me, that the connection I make between the inspiration of Fiume and the League of Fiume. Things. I mean, we just had a wonderful presentation by Dominique on her book on Fiume, and in a way, I'm very much the other side, in which it looks at this imaginary construction as extremely formative, not just for the rituals of the regime, but for actually the foreign policy that Mussolini there's. So, in that respect, I think he would see the Dalmatia more like part of this enlarged in orientamento. And that's the part that I'm thinking about, John, but I'm not sure about this. I mean, this is very much, I think, Philip has also studied these questions from other points of view of Southern Europe as a conglomerate, and he might have Philip Meinheim, who's here. And so I'm thinking that there is a lot more that I can now look at. Thank you so much for that. It's a great indication.
All right, so we have about 5 or 6 minutes left. So if anyone is still interested in asking a question, please do indicate your desire to do so in the chat dialogue. I do want to kind of indulge another question, if Claudio will allow me. You know, many of us here are Italianists, and so we understand kind of some of the background contexts to your presentation and your book. But there was one particular argument that you covered that I was aware of prior to the presentation, but that you mentioned it kind of in passing, that I thought maybe would be interesting to have you elaborate on, particularly for people who are meeting with us here today who don't have the kind of historiographical background that you're assuming. And that is the argument about Italian unification as the first African territory conquered by a European power. Now that's a really thought-provoking, but I must admit, and I think you would as well, a rather provocative, intentionally provocative argument. And I thought maybe you could expand upon that a little bit, kind of providing some background context for what you mean by that. Why is the Italian South being referred to as an African territory? And then perhaps if it's possible within a reasonable amount of time, making a connection to Mussolini's regime as the inheritor of the Making Italians project out of, you know, the Gli Africani, right, the Southerners.
So, you know, if this is the pleasure of living in California and having this wonderful audience, that, you know, had I given this talk anywhere in Italy, the first two questions would have been, so how does your neo-Borbonic interpretation of the South fit with the recent scholarship? Blah, 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 blah. I'm sorry, I'm mocking, but I have to do it, because with this title of neo-Borbonic, historians in Italy have excluded from conversations hundreds of scholars, and they have boxed themselves into a kind of minor risorgimental criticism without taking into serious consideration all of the evidence that many others around the world have brought to the interpretation of the Risorgimento as the first imperial state formation. In an epoch in which, after Benedict Anderson ends his analysis with the mid-19th century, pushes it to imperialism, but sees the origin of the nation state in the end of the 19th century. Of the 18th century, I see the birth of the empire state in the second half of the 19th century. And I think Italy is a perfect example of that. It applies immediately the biopolitics. The Southern question is set immediately into motion from the very first day that the envoy of the king arrives and says, these are Bedouins, they're worse than Bedouins, they're Africans, but it inherits everything that from the Montesquieuian 18th century has been lurking in the background. And then the Africanization is done by the Pica laws. The Pica laws that fight so-called brigantaggio, which today still we continue to call brigantaggio, a civil war that actually produced more dead than any of the risorgimental fights. Well, that brigantaggio is called this way, but it was treated with peasants having severed their heads and put on pikes at the entrance of villages, because that's the only language that savages understand. This is the Piedmontese army in the south of Italy. Now, we know these things, but we treat them as sidekicks. No, the Pica law served every imperial nation that went into Africa with examples of how to treat savages. That's where the codes of the Congolese, of the armies of the Belgians, started by inspiration from the Pica law. So I'm not making connections that are not also have very specific historical grounds, just like Lombroso's theories of the criminal mind were adopted in the United States and ended up very with a trace that can be traced to the idea of the born criminal races and all the way to contemporary racialization of crime. So in Italy, racial theory was designed first on Southerners. There's no doubt about that connection. And it was then exported to the identification of races by color. But this was a second step that was much later, after 1896 and after the Italian race theory needed to find a way to now re-white Italians because they had lost the war against the Ethiopians. Oh my God, at that point, Italians needed to be remade into whites, and the theory of the Mediterranean race was developed in that direction. But so that's very much my contention, that there is a specific biopolitics of expansion of territorialization that we need to call by their name, and are very similar to the settler colonialism that is then expanded everywhere else. The connection that you're asking me to fascism is that I think fascism in so many ways inherits, however, a southern question that has already been symbolically solved by the invasion of Libya and by this new Mediterranean dream. So it doesn't, although it effectively deals with it by not talking about it and not allowing any talk about it, it also deals with it by shifting the discourse from South to Mediterranean. Now that's the kind of playground in which fascism will enact.
Indeed, yeah, thank you for those replies. And also to kind of highlight, I think, something that you said earlier in the presentation, not only shifting the kind of southernness from southern Italy to the shores of North Africa, but also playing into the kind of Mediterranean expansionism, which is, of course, a central component of the argument of your book. All right, so we have time for just one last question, and it looks like it could be a short reply because we want to be timely. So this is asked by Philip Minahan. And it is, I would like to ask Claudio how the tensions between imperium and emporium have affected the Italian left.
Thank you. Thank you, Philip. This is very interesting because actually the current and, okay, so left, of course, it's a big word, and we all know if we are in Italian politics, but let's pretend that the Democratic Party of today is the inheritance of the left. Incredibly so, Enrico Letta is the only scholar and thinker in Italy that has given really deep thinking. I met with him in 2000 at Fiesole, and he was with me launching the Mediterranean Studies program. He was at the time a young, non-yet politician. He was a scholar, and he wrote this book, L'Italia tra il Mediterraneo e l'Europa. So he's actually somebody who comes from a more socialist background, but certainly I think that there is an argument to make that a certain Christian democratic left, which was the left that was supporting Mattei and counted La Pira and this kind of original leftist Gramscian catto-communists. Sorry if I'm using all of this terminology for others that might not be familiar with all of this, but that's the left that is most. Raniero Lavalle and others were very much always concerned with the politics of Islam long before Islam was anything of relevance in current discourse and the relationship with the African. Of all people, Andreotti was a tremendous supporter of a kind of policy with North Africa of independence, even from NATO. So you found a strange trasversale front that is not specifically left.
I see. Well, if I may, the last sentence of your book that you quote to us tells me that possibly there is a version of the sort of tension between those two models that is a part of you and your politics.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
In that sense, if I'm the representative of that left, I'm hoping to translate the book in Italian and bring some of the Italian makers and Letta and others to read it and maybe see that as an urgent project.
But then just to begin to try to clarify it in my mind, is there a general matrix that includes these differences that the left and the right and all sorts of political players within modern Italy. Do they all have their versions of this?
I think what it is, the thought of Franco Cassano, Southern thought, translated in English into Southern thought. And if I say buy a book by Franco Cassano's Southern Thought before you ever think about buying mine, but that's because he expresses something that comes from different traditions and puts together a certain common ground of discourses that I think were very influential in his region of Puglia, and in a certain South leadership that you find in many cultural expressions today, music most of all. So I would say it's a cultural area of risveglio, in which the South recognizes itself much more in Mediterranean terms than simply as South. It begins to articulate that kind of thing. So I would call it more than a left versus right, a kind of Southern contribution to the discussion.
Okay, thanks, Claudio. Congratulations. Very exciting, brilliant work.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right, so I think we're just about out of time for today's meeting. I wanted to remind each of you, if you haven't had a chance to click on the link, and if you're interested in purchasing the book at a 30% discount, you can find that information in the chat dialogue, which I've just pasted in there. Here is the book's front cover, if you haven't seen it. And I want to thank Dr. Claudio Fogu for your time and for that thought-provoking and really interesting presentation, and for the book as well, which I think is something that's going to live with a lot of us for the coming years as we kind of chew on the ideas that you've given us to think about. Thanks for everyone for attending, and don't forget, on June 2nd, we have the last of the book talks with Dr. Edward Westerman. So thank you very much.
Before you go, Brian, let me say hello to some friends, Catherine King, especially Ivan Huber, Paul Lerner, Michaela, Philip, and John. Of course, I've seen you among you, and I'm very appreciative of your being here. Thank you. And thank you.
Grazie mille a tutti e tutti.
Bye bye.